Let's listen to The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. Level A2. Oxford Reading University. Part 1.
1. Jake Barnes is an American living in Paris in the early 20s. He works in a publishing house. He also has many friends and goes to many parties. One of his friends is Robert Cohn. He comes from a rich Jewish family. He has come from America with his lover named Frances. She doesn't love him, but wants to get social status and respect. Frances plans to make him marry her. One day, Jake was having dinner at a cafe. Suddenly, he locked eyes with a pretty girl. Her name was Georgette, and she appeared to be a prostitute. They sat together and chatted. After dinner, they took a taxi and set off for another place to spend the rest of the evening. In the car, Georgette pressed herself against Jake and tried to kiss him. "Don't," he said, and pushed her away softly with his hand. "Why, are you sick?" she asked. "Yes," Jake answered, keeping his head down. "All of us are sick," the girl said. Then they were quiet. They stopped at a restaurant and entered it. Jake ordered drinks, and after a few drinks, Georgette brought up their earlier conversation again. "What is the matter with you anyway?" she asked. "I got injured in the war. Now I can't have intimate relationships with women," Jake explained. "This dirty war, it served no one," Georgette replied. She tried to keep up the conversation, which Jake wanted to avoid. Fortunately, at that moment, someone's loud voice crossed the whole room. "Barnes! Hey, Jacob Barnes!" It was Jake's friend Braddock's. At his table, Jake also saw his wife, Cohn and Frances, and a few other people he didn't know. "We are going dancing," Braddock's reported happily. "Why don't you and your lady join us?" Jake and Georgette accepted the invitation. The dancing club had almost no people, except for some single figures in the far corners of the room. Jake and his friends started dancing. Music went on. Soon they were hot, and many of them sat at the table. Others served themselves cold, fresh drinks and rested at the bar. Jake was in the middle of drinking too when he saw Brett enter the room. She was a very beautiful woman. She had a lovely face and hair as short as a boy's. Her figure was fine, and her simple clothing couldn't hide it. She was with several men who wore tidy, bright clothes. There was something soft and ladylike in their every movement. Brett noticed Jake and came up to him. "Where have you found such a fine lady?" she asked, meaning Georgette. "At a restaurant," he answered. "And you have got yourself some incredible company, too." "How is it possible that you are with a prostitute?" Brett asked. "Is love overtaking you?" "No, I am just bored," he replied. "Let us leave this place together," she suddenly suggested. "Somebody will take care of your lady." Jake agreed, and they walked out of the club holding hands. Jake noticed that Cohn was looking hard at Brett. His eyes followed her all the way to the door. Jake and Brett got into a taxi. For some time they were quiet. Then she suddenly covered her face with her hands and cried in a low voice, "Jake, I am so unhappy." 2. They drove through the city at night. In the light of a street lamp, Jake saw Brett's beautiful face clearly. He kissed her on the lips. She pushed him away softly with her hands. "Jake, I can't be with you," she said quietly. "Don't you love me?" he asked. "You know I do," she replied. She kept her head down. "I am so unhappy. Many men have been in love with me, and I have been so mean to them. Now I am paying for that." "Actually, I find my war injury rather funny," Jake said. "And being in love is funny, too." "Funny? It is nothing but awful," Brett said. "I can't stop loving you, but I can't be with you. It is breaking my heart." They were quiet. The car drove up to a cafe, and they were about to get out. Brett suddenly turned to Jake and gave him a close look in the eyes. "I have a request, Jake. Please don't get angry," she said. "I won't," he promised. "Kiss me one more time." They walked into the cafe and found their friends chatting and drinking. Jake sat at their table. Brett, a short man of unusual appearance, shouted excitedly. "Hello, Zizi," she replied. She seemed just as pleased. "I would like you to meet a friend," he said, taking her by the arm and leading her to the table. "This is Count Mippopopoulos from Greece." "Hello, Lady Brett," he said politely. He clearly liked her as soon as he laid eyes on her. Jake's friends were about to leave. He got up from the table as well. "Are you leaving already?" Brett asked in a worried voice. "Yes, I have a headache," he replied, and walked away. 3. The following afternoon, Robert Cohn came to Jake's office and invited him to lunch. They sat together at a cafe. Cohn complained about Frances. "She doesn't let me do what I want. Aren't we supposed to live our lives to the fullest?" he asked. "Only bullfighters can do that," Jake responded sadly, and they were quiet. Then Cohn said, "Tell me more about Lady Brett." He pushed his plate away from him and prepared to listen carefully. "How long have you known her?" he asked. Jake wasn't surprised at all. Clearly, Cohn liked Brett very much. "She was a nurse in the hospital where I stayed during the war," Jake told him. "Is she single now?" Cohn asked. Jake could feel that Cohn wanted to talk about Brett for as long as possible. He kept questioning Jake. He wanted to know everything about her and her love affairs. Jake wasn't enjoying the conversation. He answered rudely and said bad things about Brett. "She is leaving her husband and marrying Michael Campbell for the money," Jake said, and then added, "She also drinks a lot." Cohn became angry with Jake. "Don't talk about her in such a manner. I don't believe a woman like her could marry for any reason but love," he replied. "But she has done it twice," Jake said. Cohn was out of his mind with anger. "If you don't like my answers, then perhaps your questions were stupid," Jake said. Cohn jumped to his feet and was about to leave. "Please sit down," Jake told him, "and forget what I said. I am sorry." 4. The next day, Jake meets Cohn and Frances at a cafe. Frances asks for a one-on-one talk with Jake. She tells him that Cohn has refused to marry her. He thinks that he will soon become a successful author. And when he becomes famous, he wants to enjoy life and other women. So Frances is going to stay single because no one else will marry her. Jake doesn't say anything in reply. He doesn't want to get involved in this situation. He suggests they go back to Cohn. When they return, Cohn and Frances start arguing. Jake doesn't want to watch them argue, so he takes his leave. Jake came home to find Brett and Count Mippopopoulos at his door. "Will you let us in, dear?" Brett asked in a sweet and soft voice. "Of course," he replied. They went into the kitchen to make drinks while Jake changed his clothes. Soon Brett entered his room with a glass in her hand and found him lying on his bed. "I love you so much, Brett," Jake said, and closed his eyes. "And I want to be with you." She sat down on his bed and held his hand softly. "We can't be together, Jake. If we become a couple, I know for sure I will have affairs with other men. And one day, it will break your heart," she said. They were quiet. Jake looked at her sadly. "I am leaving for Spain tomorrow," Brett suddenly told him. Jake was about to cry. He wanted to go with her, but he knew that it was impossible. Then they heard noises from the kitchen. Count Mippopopoulos was making himself a drink. Brett and Jake joined him, and all of them started drinking champagne. As they sat together, the Count told many great stories about his life. After dinner, they went to a club, and Jake danced with Brett. "You make a great couple," the Count told them as they joined him at his table. "Why don't you get married?" Jake told the first thing that occurred to him. "We want to focus on our own lives." "And we have our careers," Brett added. They had another drink together. Soon Brett felt unwell. They said goodbye to Count Mippopopoulos, and Jake walked Brett to her hotel. At the door, they stopped and kissed. She pushed him away. "No, please," she said. "Good night, Jake." The door shut, and Jake went home. 5. Jake hasn't seen Brett for some time. He receives a letter saying that she has gone to San Sebastian, a beautiful city in the north of Spain. Later, Jake learns that Cone has left Paris for a vacation. A few days later, Jake's old friend Bill arrives from America. He is going to travel around Europe. They spend time together in Paris. Soon, Brett comes back from Spain. Her fiancé, Michael, finally appears in Paris too. One day, Jake receives a letter from Cone. He invites him and Bill to Spain for a fishing trip. Jake buys tickets to the bullfights in Pamplona, and they agree to come. One day, Jake sat in a cafe. He saw Brett and her fiancé come in. "I have heard that you are going to Spain," Michael said. "Yes," Jake replied. "Bill and I are leaving on June 25th in the morning." "Certainly you won't mind if Brett and I join you?" Michael asked, laughing. "Brett has never been to Pamplona. It is her dream." Jake wanted to be polite. "Of course," he replied. "Just prepare everything you need for the fishing trip." They chatted for some time. Then Brett asked Jake to take her to the hotel. As they were walking down the street, she suddenly said, "Is Robert Cone coming with us too?" "Yes," Jake replied. Brett seemed a little worried. "But is it going to be all right?" she asked. Jake was lost. "Why are you asking?" "Because I was in San Sebastian with him," Brett answered. Jake was quiet for some time. Finally, he told her, "Good for you." He didn't have anything else to say. 6. In late June, Jake and Bill arrived in Pamplona. Cone kept away from them. He wanted to avoid the talk about his vacation in San Sebastian with Brett. He thought that Brett could be in trouble because of that trip. Jake and Bill spent a few days in Pamplona and then decided to go fishing in the little town of Burgett. Cone refused to go with them. He stayed in Pamplona, waiting for Brett and Michael. Jake and Bill went to Burgett on a bus. Early in the morning the next day, they picked up some insects and went to the river. It was a clear, warm day. They caught many fish. They enjoyed the views of the Spanish countryside. Wide fields and deep forests full of bright colors were around them. Jake and Bill lay down under trees with their eyes closed, enjoying the fresh, clean air. They drank wine and remembered their old friends. "Listen," Bill suddenly asked, "have you ever been in love with Brett?" "For a very long time," Jake replied, "but I don't care for her anymore." They spent 5 wonderful days in Burgett. In all that time, they didn't hear a word from Cone, Brett, or Mike. 7. Jake and Bill returned to Pamplona. The owner of their hotel, Montoya, welcomes Jake warmly because they are both fans of bullfights. Jake stays at his hotel every year during the fiesta. Montoya tells them that their friends have already arrived. He also says that the bulls will be in Pamplona in the evening. Jake and Bill are quite excited. Immediately, they go out in search of their friends. Jake and Bill found Brett, Mike, and Cone in a small street cafe. Together, they went to watch the bulls. They couldn't take their eyes off the cages. The bulls inside were enormous. They ran around and hit each other hard. Then they calmed down a little. Mike offered to go for a drink, and they took a taxi to a cafe. After a few drinks, Mike turned to Cone. "You know, sometimes you don't invite people to keep you company, but they still follow you everywhere. I consider it strange." Cone seemed surprised. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You are around Brett too often," Michael explained in a cold voice. "Shut up, Michael, you are drunk," Brett cried out. "I am not drunk," Michael replied. "I am speaking my mind. Why do you follow Brett around? You are a fool if you think that I don't care." Everyone grew nervous. Mike went on. "I know that Brett spends time with other men. She has been with many, and all of them were better than you, a stupid Jew." Cone's face turned white. Bill stood up and pulled him by the arm. "Come with me, Cone," he said, and led him out to the street. Jake came back to the hotel late at night. He was drunk and went straight to bed, but he couldn't sleep for a long time. In the next room, he heard Brett and Michael laughing. It is amazing, he thought to himself, to be friends with a woman. To be a woman's friend, a man has to be in love with her. And with Brett in particular, it is especially strange. I enjoyed our friendship, but I didn't realize that one has to pay for everything in life. In the end, you can only enjoy what you have paid for. Anyway, all this thinking is stupid too, he thought before he fell asleep.
Part 2 is coming soon. It's hard to read books in English when there are so many unknown words. What if you could click the word and see the translation and the transcription? Then reading English books will become easy and fun. You can do it in the Ava app. You can check the meaning of the words in your native language. Check out ava.com now. Hit the like button and subscribe for more English stories like this. And now, listen to another audiobook.